Hey, good night, everyone. It's me and George here. We're just having a late night hangout, just discussing some research we've been doing the last couple weeks. We'll probably be chatting for an hour and a half or so. Maybe we'll make go for the 2 hours. We'll see. But George, yeah, George was going to start us off tonight with some of the research he was doing.
Hello, thank you, Eric, and good evening, and whoever else might be listening or be listening to the show. I guess after Eric uploads it, it's just about 9:20 p.m. here in the Pacific time zone. It is still Tuesday evening, April the 23rd. I realize it is now Wednesday, April 24th, in Ontario, Canada, where Eric is, or I believe that's where Eric is. Um, Anyhow, this we haven't done a show in a couple weeks, and there are a number of things that have happened since we've done our last show, which is invariably the case. I did not mention this, but over the weekend we had a couple significant anniversaries. Last Friday, the 19th, was the 24th anniversary of the Waco. I'm sorry, the Oklahoma City bombing, and which took place in 1995, obviously. And it was also the 26th anniversary of the Waco massacre in 1993. Also, the following day, Saturday the 20th, would have been Adolf Hitler's 130th birthday and was the 20th anniversary of the Columbine shooting in Colorado. It just which was I guess Columbine is a suburb of Denver. Yesterday, well, it was yesterday here, Monday the 22nd, was also the 49th Earth Day. And it also would have been Vladimir Ulyanov, better known as Vladimir Lenin's birthday. He was born in 1869. Now, I know I'm throwing out a bunch of dates, but I just thought I would, just mention those in passing. Perhaps we can talk about those later on the show if we have any time, or perhaps if we do a show later on the week. This is what is on my docket.
Well, George, just very quickly here, you mentioned you said the anniversary of the Waco massacre.
Yes, 1993. So it would have been
I just
26
found
years.
okay. I found an interesting connection. I was doing some research on Interpol and just on some of who have been like the American secretaries and like presidents who have been appointed Interpol. I found two of them, but both the Americans I found were trained by the Jesuits. But in particular, this guy here called Ronald Noble. He was the 7th Secretary General of Interpol. But you see, he was where did this guy go to school? Or actually, this guy wasn't trained by the Jesuits, but he was made an Order of Saint Gregory the Great. So Vatican knighted this Secretary General of Interpol, Ronald Noble. But it says here on the Wikipedia, it says he was in 1993. Noble was appointed Undersecretary of the Treasury for Enforcement, being placed in charge of the Secret Service, the ATF, which was the organization that was overseeing the Branch Davidians incident at Waco. So he was the head of the ATF, the Customs Service of Enforcement, the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, the Office of Foreign Assets Control, and the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. And this is like quote from Wikipedia. Ronald Noble, who is an Order of Saint Gregory the Great, was the head of the department's Waco Administrative Review Team, which produced a report on the ATF's actions against the Branch Davidians leading the Waco siege. I thought that was a very interesting connection, to say the least. And it says he had the support of FBI Director Louis Freeh on Wikipedia. And Louis Freeh at this time, I think he's Opus Dei. There's multiple sources I've seen that Louis Freeh is like a member of Opus Dei, the FBI director. And I know he sent his son to Georgetown University, for instance. I just wanted to bring that up just because I heard when you mentioned Waco. I just thought of this connection I found recently. And I'll link this guy's Wikipedia page in the chat, but his name is Ronald Noble. He was the 7th Secretary General of Interpol.
Well, I mentioned on the show last year, so about a year ago, when we talked about Columbine. But forgive me. Well, I can bring it up again since you were talking about a year ago. Well, the sheriff of Jefferson County, Colorado, is Jeff Schrader. He's been there for 33 years with that sheriff's department. So he was, I guess, like a junior deputy when Columbine took place. Now, Schrader got his master's degree from Regis University. So he was not in charge, but he was definitely in the pipeline. So this is something Johnny and I discussed a year ago, actually off air. So he very well could have been, Schrader could very well have been elevated to sheriff, is like a reward for services rendered. Good job.
Oh,
Um,
absolutely. George, this is a reoccurring theme. I was gonna do a video on this, but like I decided I was gonna wait to talk about this tonight. But Alan, the prominent U.S. attorney Alan Ryan, for
mhm.
instance, he authored the official U.S. government report on Klaus Barbie, and the report said, like, it's on like page 165 of the report. It says that the CIA at no point had any connections with Klaus Barbie, like, which is a joke. Like, it's documented like extensively that the CIA had connections with Klaus Barbie. Like, he was in Bolivia under the alias Klaus Alterman, like serving Hugo Banzer, who was like a CIA puppet, as Hugo Banzer's like defense minister, for instance. But after Alan Ryan like did that whitewash report, he coincidentally became a professor of law at Jesuit Boston College. Just like
Well,
coincidental. Like literally after like whitewashing like the Klaus Barbie Nazi report, Alan Ryan became a professor at a Jesuit university. I just thought that can't be a coincidence.
well, I mean, okay, I'm actually going to do a presentation on this in just a bit on um, the TV show What's My Line, but I'm going to hold off. Oh, okay. Well, thank you for giving me that segue. There is a TV show on CBS which aired originally from 1950 to 1975 called What's My Line. For those who aren't familiar with it, you had the host and three celebrity guests, and there's two parts of the show. They'd have somebody come on the show and who had a job or a skill that was unusual or rare, and the panels had to ask quite yes or no questions to find out, what was significant about this person. Then the other part of the show is the celebrity panels would be blindfolded, and somebody famous, a politician, an actor, would you know come on the show, and they had to guess, who it is. There again, they'd ask something like 10 yes or no questions. So, and this wasn't supposed to be a presentation on the show. However, the original host was a fellow by the name of John Daly, who lived from 1914 to 1991. He was born in South Africa. His father was a U.S. geologist who was working there. So the young Daly, John Daly, went to Morris Brothers High School in Johannesburg. And he actually moved back to the United States and got a degree in journalism from Boston College. Okay, so I'm sure that might have piqued your curiosity. Well, and of course he used, because right after he graduated, I guess like around 1936 or so, he immediately became a reporter for CBS Radio. He held that position until 1950, so he worked for CBS Radio for 14 years. And he wasn't just a lowly beat reporter. He was the first U.S. radio reporter to break the story on Pearl Harbor, the death of FDR,
Okay,
Franklin
just
Delano.
right off the bat, okay, just like Mika Brzezinski was like the first reporter to break 9/11, Pearl
Yeah,
Harbor, like 9/11 was a Jesuitical deep state event, like that. Like you brought up to me, like strategically, like they didn't hit Edward Dohany's oil reserves, like when they
yes,
took out Pearl Harbor. They basically took out a bunch of like useless, like shipping supplies, but like they didn't take out their Papal Knights oil reserves at Elk Hills, which that was like the whole basis of the Teapot Dome scandal, was that Ed Doheny
mhm,
like unfairly got the contracts to the naval oil reserves out in Hawaii, and the Japanese didn't spare it, and like the Yamamoto, was a Catholic pilot who was leading the surge, but that's just great information, George. If this
okay.
if this John Daly is the
So
first reporter to break Pearl Harbor, and he was at Boston
he,
College.
he was
Was that the
okay.
school?
Okay. Television didn't really become popular until after World War II. It didn't really. Did exist, but it didn't really become commercially available until 1945. and people didn't start watching television in large number until the 1950s because TVs were expensive. So it was a back. I don't know this from experience, but this is what people have told me, is that it was a big deal to have a TV. Back then, it cost several hundred, dollars. So it was for years. It was cost prohibitive. So you might have a neighbor who had a TV, or you might have your local restaurant or bar might have one. So well into the 1950s, people usually got their information from newspapers, newsreels, radio, things like that. And you still had newsreels even into the 1950s, even though it was essentially obsolete. But I'm giving probably a little bit too much information. So you mentioned this fellow, I forgot his name, who was rewarded. I'm drawing a blank. He basically was given a professorship for services rendered. Um, well, and of course, I mentioned this deputy who's now the sheriff of Jefferson County, Colorado, Jeff Schrader. Well, you could say that Daley's payoff was he got to host the first daily or the first TV game show called What's My Line, which, as I said, aired from 1950 to 1975. And
Oh,
so I said to you,
that game show, that was before like the Merv Griffin show and all those shows, because Merv Griffin himself was I think he was Jesuit educated.
yes, I believe you mentioned one of your videos. He went to the University of San Francisco. So this is his reward. So he got to, okay, just knowing a few facts about John Daley. Okay, I just want to camp on this for just a moment. You mentioned Mika Brzezinski, the daughter of Zbigniew Brzezinski. Mika got her degree from Georgetown. Her dad, Zbigniew, was a papal knight of Malta, a devout Polish Roman Catholic. He went to not McGill. He went to, I believe, Loyola Montreal, which is like basically their version of like the Canadian version of Georgetown Prep. Because if you go there, it's pretty much a fait accompli. You're going to be somebody important. You're going to be a judge. You're going to be a secretary of state, or something along those lines. Anyhow, so Daley's payoff, if you will, his reward was he got to host this show, which is a fairly big deal. Now I'm going to skip to my next.
No, just thanks for bringing this guy up, George. I've linked his Wikipedia in the live chat, so people can check him out. Just it says here he also mediated like a meeting between Khrushchev and Nixon.
Yes.
So bridging like this, because Khrushchev was also Khrushchev was meeting with Nelson Rockefeller, for instance. Khrushchev was a puppet of the CIA, on both sides. Khrushchev was in power, the Gary Francis Powers YouTube spy plane incident. That was pretty much all Jesuit theater to keep the Cold War going, and that's why they sent Jesuit-trained James Donovan over to get at James Donovan at Fordham. He was also a lawyer, at the Nuremberg trials. He was pivotal in freeing a whole bunch of high-level Nazis. That's why they sent James Donovan, the Jesuit-trained, over to quote-unquote free Gary Francis Powers from the Soviets. And then they even recently turned that into a Jesuit theater movie with Tom Hanks. I think it was called Bridge of Spies.
Yes, directed by his buddy Steven Spielberg. And one of the people, it wasn't a cameo, but one of the people who had a bit role in it was Alan Alda, who went to Fordham. So, I know you.
Alan Alda, I think he's involved in the Fordham. He speaks at the Fordham commencements and stuff like that. I've seen him on a list.
Okay, so of course he's an alumni, and his dad went there as well, Robert Alda. So anyhow, getting to my say, so just by knowing something about the life of John Daley, this brings together several points: the news media, bread and circuses, entertainment, history. It's all So almost everything we think is true, almost if you think about all the major events of the 20th century, uh, uh, almost all of them were either manufactured or manipulated. And John Daly was there, and he was rewarded. And as I said, he was rewarded with this TV show. Now he did do other things, but that is what he's best remembered for.
Oh,
Now,
just to think of
as a,
George, just quickly with the Jesuits, like they had the control, they had the narrative controlled with Japan, like on the diplomatic front and like the mass media front. Daily, with the mass media giving the message to everyone, and they had Frank Commodore Walker. Where does was he Fordham also? No, he wasn't Ford. I know he went to a
Walker,
Jesuit.
no, he got his, believe his law degree at Notre Dame, his undergrad at Gonzaga.
Oh,
I'm not
Gonzaga. Yeah, so
okay.
they had a Jesuit trained, diplomat as FDR's private or personal representative to the Japanese government also. So like, it was controlled like on all levels.
So anyhow, so I was going to skip ahead to one of my other points, number 4, but I had a couple of things I was going to mention before that. Politicians who are on talk shows. I sent you some videos. Well, okay. Before I get back, before I hit that point, I just want to bring that up. Um, the As I said, the original "What's My Line" ran for a quarter century, and I sent you a clip from was it yesterday or something of a nun from the 1950s who was also a dentist. She was one of only handful of religious sisters who are nuns or who are I'm sorry, dentists. Also, there's a clip of Fulton Sheen on the show, and so I just wonder, maybe I should do a search. I can send you this, Don. How many famous Catholics were on the show? Priests, archbishops, things like that. Somebody who was on the show, who was a regular co-host of the show, was a newspaper columnist named Dorothy Kilgallen. Yes, she was a good a good Irish Catholic lass. She lived from 1913 to 1965, November the 8th, 1965. And of course, she was a good puppet, since, she was trained with the Catholics. I'm not sure where she went to school. I know where she went to college. She went to New Rochelle College, which is secular. However, she mentioned on the show that she was trained. She went to a Catholic school. I don't know for like high school or something, but she was a columnist for the Hearst Corporation. Um, and she wrote like a socialite column. She reviewed plays and movies and things like that. However, she got out of line, I think. So I think she could have got the Tim Russert treatment. Um, of course, being a good Irish Roman Catholic, she was
Well,
completely.
at this time, like the guy leading the Hearst was like a devout papist, probably like the biggest papist to have led Hearst. Like this was during the 50s. That was
Yeah.
Richard E. Berlin. Richard E. Berlin was like a Knight of Malta, devout friend of Cardinal Spellman. In a book I have in physical, I put this on my archive page called Hearst Over Hollywood. It's shown that Richard E. Berlin was like a devout or a staunch admirer of Charles Coughlin, and Richard E. Berlin had like paintings of Jewish victims of the Holocaust in his Los Angeles mansion, as William Randolph Hearst did also. Like in the book, it talked about how Richard E. Berlin had paintings of Holocaust victims in his house. But like saying he's the type of Catholic though that he would fire you if you weren't following the code, the canon law.
Well, she was a little bit more than fired. You could say that. I think she probably got the Tim Russert treatment. In that she was, she said this publicly. She was completely devastated when JFK was assassinated, John F. Kennedy. And like Mae Russert, I don't think they actually knew each other. She knew the whole Warren report was complete bunk. I'll put it that way. And she said so publicly. And she said, a matter of fact, I want to interview Jack Ruby. and get his side of the story, because something just doesn't seem right. And as a matter of fact, she lived in New York, and she was planning on going to Dallas, Texas, to go interview him. This is in November 1965. She had no history of depression. She wasn't seeing a psychiatrist or anything like that, but she allegedly committed suicide. There's different accounts as to how she died, but I guess she must have had an acute case of depression. So just like a few days before she could go to Dallas, she was found dead in her New York apartment.
Well, it's very. I'm gonna look up the wiki. What was the last name again, George, of this nun?
No, she wasn't a nun. She was
Or
actually Dorothy May Gallen, Kilgallen.
oh, I thought. Sorry, I thought I heard you. I thought this was like a Catholic who had a show. But okay. So you mentioned there's a lot of Catholics who came onto the show. Okay, I must have heard it.
Yeah, she was like one of the co-hosts. Now on the show, what's my line? I remember I sent you a clip of a nun who was also a dentist, so they had to guess who she was, or they had to guess, what she did. Also, Fulton J. Sheen was a guest on the show. So
I think I personally think he was like a secret Jesuit. Fulton Sheen, definitely.
Okay, so the people were so. Also one of the guests was like James Cagney, who was a popular film star from the 1930s and 40s and things like that. So they might as well have called it, "What's my papal line?" But that's because almost all the people on the show as guests, as hosts.
So I think it sounds like the guest that would come on like William Buckley's show, Firing Line. Honestly.
Yes.
Is that crowd?
Well, speaking of that crowd, so we're talking about the 1950s and 60s, 50, 60 years ago, but this is still going on today. I mentioned that somebody whom I'm going to talk about in just a moment is Pete Buttigieg, or that's what I prefer to say butt geek, but that's I'm not sure how you get Buttigieg out of that, but anyhow, he's the mayor of South Bend, Indiana. I know that he's been on the Stephen Colbert show, and he's supposed to be on the Jimmy Fallon show. They don't call it the Tonight Show, but so I know you did a video in your a talk show host, Jimmy Kimmel, Jimmy Fallon, Stephen Colbert.
Oh yeah, it's Colbert and his dad, if people aren't aware, was a professor. I don't know if he still is, but Colbert's dad was a professor at Jesuit St. Louis University.
Okay.
So he's So he's. I gotta find a term for like like the term trust fund baby. I gotta find a term for. I guess he's like a papist baby. I guess, but that'll do for now.
Well, okay. Well, you see, the thing is, okay. So we're talking about What's My Line, back from the 1950s and 60s, and it seems as if that to be a guest on the show or to be one of the co-hosts, you had to be plugged in the machine, and that appears to be the case today. But
absolutely, yeah. You can't be like, you can't get on the big screen without. Look at MSNBC. Like they have John Brennan as a national correspondent now. John Brennan's on MSNBC like 4 days a week. Jesuit trained at Fordham, like literally like a papal crusader, like a FBI deputy or CIA deputy director during 9/11. Literally. He was responsible for like creating the disposition matrix kill list, which is like that was incorporated into the National Defense Authorization Act. For instance, John Brennan is like literally he literally epitomizes the national security state, and he's like an MSNBC correspondent, for instance. So this is the message that they're setting. So like if you're not gonna get on to like a platform like that, without kissing the ring. So,
okay,
look at Oliver North is a correspondent on Fox News. like after like 20 years after, like he, illegally gave billions of dollars and weapons, to Iranian Contras. Like, and it's just incredible. Like, and that's probably why Rupert Murdoch is a papal knight of Saint Gregory the Great, running Fox News, like worth $20 billion. And like like Rupert Murdoch has been baiting people into thinking that the Jews control the media, for instance. But yeah, like literally like, across the board, like the governor of New York, Chris Cuomo, like his brother Andrew Cuomo is a correspondent on CNN. Both of them are Jesuit trained at Fordham. Pretty much, all the line, like all of them are Catholic on Fox. For instance, like Brett Baer, Sean Hannity. On MSNBC, Chris Matthews is Jesuit trained. Like back in the 70s, there was a Jesuit priest, Tom McLaughlin, that had his own show on MSNBC, the McLaughlin Group. I think it was running for like 20 years.
Yes,
and then like an ordained Jesuit priest, having a cable news show.
Okay, well, you mentioned McLaughlin. He actually left the order. He was allegedly laitized, and that means you're no longer a priest. And he actually got.
No, thanks for correcting that. I wasn't aware of that. Was that so? Okay. Was this after he like ran for like he was going to run for, I think, a Senate seat?
Well, New Hampshire, Vermont, or well, so he actually got laitized like in the mid 1970s, but he was working for the Nixon administration with his buddy Pat Buchanan.
Yeah, actually, he was Nixon's official speechwriter at one point.
Yes, something like that. And I'll have to talk about John McLaughlin. That's worthy. That's worth discussing in a separate report. However, you know how we're talking about this fellow John Daly, how almost 80 years ago he broke the story of Pearl Harbor, as I've already said, which was one of the most seminal events in American history, or at least in 20th century, up until 9/11. It was probably arguably the biggest event in American history in the 20th century. And he was the one who broke the story, just like our girl Mika Brzezinski, broke 9/11. Now we've already established this, and so his payoff was he got to host this show, one of the most popular shows of his day. Now, it seems as if if you're a prominent U.S. politician, and it's not just U.S. politicians. I mean, I understand that. What's his? I'm drawing a blank. Your Prime Minister, Trudeau, Justin Trudeau. Whenever he comes to the United States, he's been a popular guest on the Stephen Colbert Show and things like that. Because
Trudeau's basically turned into a U.S. politician. Like if you hear Justin Trudeau talking about the current coup in Venezuela, supporting Jesuit-trained Juan Guaido. That's an interesting fact. What the university Juan Guaido went to is called the Andrés Bello Catholic University in Venezuela, and it's run by the Jesuits, and it was completely financed by the Inter-American Development Bank. It's interesting fact. But like Trudeau, was just hearing him talk about like supporting the coup, like he sounded like an American politician, which was I thought was funny. And Trudeau recently, in the news, he gave Loblaws a $12 million corporate payout. Canada believes in corporate welfare very heavily, but that he gave Loblaws $12 million for their fridges when they're already Loblaws is worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But, Trudeau continues to be enact his Jesuitical ways. And if people aren't aware, when Trudeau, I just found this recently. The Globe and Mail covered this, George. But when Trudeau was sworn on office, this was the week he was sworn in, he sent Pope Francis a multiple books on the Jesuit orders early activities in Canada, which I thought was interesting.
Well, okay. I'm sure Jorge appreciated that, and
I'm sure too. Yeah, Trudeau, it's a disgrace. It can't. If you watch footage of the Canadian a session taking place, that they're debating feminism. He's like, I don't hate women. Look at all these women I've appointed into my cabinet. and the conservatives like, oh, you are a bigot. You do discriminate against women. Blah 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 blah.
Well,
Because it's Jesuit theater, and like Andrew Scheer, the guy who's running against Trudeau, like is literally an employee. Like he's a deacon of the Ottawa Archdiocese. It's just a disgrace. So they can't. You can make the case Canada is like more Jesuitized than America at this point. Like even like the Archbishop of the capital city is a Jesuit, Terence Pettergraph.
Well, I wasn't going to mention this, but I probably said this before. But I live in Catawba, California, which is roughly an hour north of San Francisco, which is where I live is part of the Santa Rosa Diocese, which is part of the San Francisco Archdiocese. Now, the so-called Bishop of Santa Rosa is Robert Vasa. Even though he's just a regular priest, he got a law degree from St. Gregory Pontifical Rome. So he was trained by the Jesuits. So it's just like.
Oh, sorry, George, I didn't hear the name. Who is this guy?
Robert Vasa, Vasa. He's not a big name in American current events. But as I said, so he got his law degree in canon law, or he got his canon law degree from St. Gregory Pontifical Academy in Rome. So, and as I said, the current district attorney of my county, Jill Ravitch, got her law degree from the University of San Francisco. As I said, the town where I live, Catawba, has a population of less than 10,000. So basically, like 6,000. The adjacent town, Runich Park, which is where Sonoma State University is, where I got my degree, was the co-founder of the town was a fellow by the name of Morris Frederick in 1962. Fredericks got his law degree from University of Santa Clara, and he went to a local Catholic high school. So you could say, for all intents and purposes, the Jesuits founded a town.
Well, it sounds like it up there. It's incredible how much control they have. Like, I just found this out like a couple days ago. I was watching the Toronto Raptors, and I was curious. Like, I wasn't aware where the Toronto Raptors announcers went to school. And like, lo and behold, I look it up as Jack Armstrong, who's been doing the Toronto Raptors play-by-play. Like, and again, that's a big deal. Like, the Toronto Raptors are the only professional basketball team in Canada. Like, they have a huge fan base up here. But Jack Armstrong went to Fordham, our play-by-play guy.
Okay, so I just wondering,
I guess the two microcosms where we're at, Southern Ontario and California, like, are absolutely controlled by the Jesuits. But I guess those two, they're big population centers. So you're seeing how they control like those areas from our perspectives is a good indication of how they're controlling the world, like on a bigger scale.
Okay, and which reminds me of a point. We're talking about puppets, whether you're talking about politics, news media. All the popular politicians, those who may be running for president or something like that, or newly elected, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ilhan Omar.
Actually, George, I found Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez even wrote an op-ed in the Jesuit America magazine. She wrote the article was like, about her, like what the Catholic, like being a Catholic means to her. But she literally wrote an article in the Jesuit magazine. Like, how more obvious could it get that she's completely owned?
Well, yes. Now, as I mentioned, AOC, who actually, before she got in politics, she went by Sandy, but that's beside the point. So AOC, Ilhan Omar, Pete Buttigieg, Kamala Harris, Cory Booker have all been on the shows. Jimmy Fallon, Stephen Colbert, Jimmy Kimmel. So when that happens,
Adam Schiff recently. Actually, George, with Adam Schiff, like, that was great information you found. He recently spoke at Loyola Chicago. And,
yes,
he's been spearheading, like, being the head of the Senate Intelligence Committee. Like, he's spearheading the whole RussiaGate, craze. And
Okay.
doubtlessly he's being spoon-fed by his Jesuit masters to do that, and that's why he went to Loyola Chicago. Just great information on finding that. Sorry, keep going.
Okay. Which brings, I mean, this has happened before, but it's getting harder and harder to differentiate the line between politics and entertainment. Now, I'm not. There have been other politicians who are actors besides Trump, and you had Ronald Reagan, and you've had a few others here and there, but it seems as if that in the last decade or so, that it's getting harder and harder to differentiate between the two. That one of the sine qua nons, if you're going to run for office.
And I would say that's because, well, ultimately, as a whole, like the terms of globalization, like tourism and entertainment is like a vital part of this control system.
Yes.
And every single year, tourism has been, going up, and tourism literally feeds this machine. And that's
Okay.
and actually just in DuPont Dynasty by Gerard Colby. I'll let you keep going here, George. Just he quotes a paper that the Knight of Malta, John J. Raskob, wrote. Raskob was a high-level financier at DuPont and GM, but Raskob literally quote unquote prophesizes the future of how our economy is going to become more based on tourism and entertainment as the future progresses. That was all that what Raskob was planning.
Okay, so I mean, this has happened before, but it seems as if okay, if you're somebody like Alexander Ocasio-Cortez or Ilhan Omar or something like that, and part of the things, there are several things you have to do. You have to be on social media, Twitter, Instagram, all that sort of stuff, but you also had to go on these talk shows. By going on a show like Stephen Colbert or Jimmy Fallon or whatever the case may be, they're sending a message. These people have been vetted and approved, and they're our puppets. They're going to do exactly what we tell them to do. Well, they can be hardcore leftists, or they can pretend to be they can be right wingers, but they're part of the machine. So, will that sound like an accurate assessment?
And operating with a script, essentially, scripted
Yes.
roles, they have scripted boundaries set. You can't go over this line, you can't go over this line. You have to stay within a certain framework.
Now, yes. Now, with somebody especially like AOC or Ilhan Omar, whenever they get off script, they start stumbling and fumbling. And this has been particularly true with Kamala Harris. For example, we'll just mention AOC. She's very good about hitting her bullet points. Like, we need the new Green Deal. We need a $15 an hour minimum wage in the U.S. That's U.S. I'm not sure what that
If I'm not mistaken, she wants to legalize all the immigrants coming over, doesn't she?
Oh, yes, of course.
Essentially, that would add 15 to 20 million Catholics into the U.S. if she were to do that.
Okay. Now, I probably have said this to you before, or I probably have said this before, but AOC has done videos, or at least her handlers have created her, have allowed her to do videos. Like, we need to pass the Green New Deal because of quote global end quote warming or climate change. The world's going to end in the year 2030.
Yeah, that's right. And I think Pope Francis, I know America Magazine wrote an article in 2015 calling him the planetary Pope, saying he's here to save the planet from global warming. It was it's funny.
Anyhow, I've said this before, but forgive me for repeating myself. It's interesting. She said she's advocating the Green New Deal, and something she said in one of her videos is climate change or the fight against climate change is our World War II. So that should raise a couple of red flags. Who was the author of the original New Deal? Which is a rhetorical question. Also, how many people, unless they pulled out their phones or their tablets, would know how many kids today, how many millennials would have any idea what the original New Deal was? How many people? How many adults?
Well, George, I've seen I've seen a study where I think it was 35 to 45% of U.S. college graduates didn't even know who Franklin Delano Roosevelt was.
Yes.
Let
Okay.
alone, yeah. So like that you know that man, that I guess scary. Oof. But you know, if you're dealing with a population, 40% of the U.S. Electorate doesn't know who FDR is. Probably, I think it's safe to say that 65% have no idea what the New Deal was.
Yes. Oh, okay. Well, so, but as I
I
said,
guess,
she talked about. So she's talked about the new. She's been a big advocate, or her handlers rather, have been a big proponents of this Green New Deal. And one of the things she said in the video is that climate change, or the fight against climate change, is our World War II. So the question is, or the questions are, who are
like
the
just really
authors?
quickly, like immediately off the bat, George, like World War II, like 100 million dead. Is she saying that like? I don't know, like equating it, like is she saying that like I don't know, just on a literal sense, is she saying this? If this is, she's saying this is World War II, like she's basically implying that like millions will die because millions died during World War II. Like it's
Okay,
a chaotic situation. Like,
so this is not really a discussion about the World War II, or as I prefer to call it, the final stage of the second 30 Years of War. However, you could just say, well, who are the authors of, well, just before I address the World War II question, who are the authors of the New Deal of the 1930s? Well, let's see now. We've discussed before.
one of them is Nelson Rockefeller.
Uh, Probably, well, it's probably like,
JP Morgan, uh, Irene DuPont, John J. Raskow, Nicholas Frederick Brady, Thomas Fortune,
Walsh.
Edmund Walsh, S.J., Frank
Yes.
M. Folsom. Frank M. Folsom absolutely was one of them. Papal Knight of Malta, head of the RCA Corporation. James Farley, he was FDR's like kingmaker, the head of the DNC, who campaigned for Roosevelt to get him in. Devout Catholic, Knight of Malta, and that's why I thought it was interesting that look, this I think the business plot was the more I look into the business plot, the more I think it wasn't like a serious coup attempt, because like Roosevelt nominated Jesuit-trained Frank Murphy to the Supreme Court, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
And but the New Deal did but the Gold Standard Act, like a good source for this is Emmanuel Josephson's book, The Federal Reserve Conspiracy and the Rockefellers, their gold standard. But Roosevelt's the Gold Standard Act essentially like just centralized control of like the gold supply, but it gave the Federal Reserve all of the the gold supplies. Like it was post Roosevelt's quote unquote reforms that all the gold bars were shipped to Fort Knox, for instance. Like the transferring of like the nations, or like the gold of the nation, like because like theoretically the people of the United States, it's the people's gold. So, like it was after Roosevelt's reforms where that gold was shipped to Fort Knox, for instance. But that's a good source if people want to. I'm gonna put it on archive.org soon. But it's Emmanuel Josephson, the Federal Reserve Conspiracy and the Rockefellers, and it really goes into the New Deal, probably like 70 pages, just into like the communist, because there was a lot of communist underlying to the New Deal as well, because it's like full government control. Like, the United States government is given like totalitarian powers with like Roosevelt's policies that were created.
Okay, something I wanted to mention. The name came up was Edmund Aloysius Walsh, who lived from 1885 to 1956. So, just for those who don't know, I know you can go look him up. Among other things, he founded the School of Foreign Services at Georgetown. He was an observer at Versailles. He was an advisor to Joseph Stalin in the 1920s. He was an advisor to FDR in the 1930s, to Harry Truman, when he became president, Douglas MacArthur. He was an observer at Nuremberg after World War II, as well as the Tokyo trial. He established two different schools in Iraq, a university and a high school, I don't remember. And he was involved in some sort of shenanigans in Mexico. So basically, so he honestly got a great deal of use out of his frequent flyer miles. I mean, how did he have time to sleep? I mean, he basically was everywhere at once. But speaking of Edmund Walsh, I told you that I went to this spring. I've been going to these lecture series at my old school. I didn't go today or yesterday. Uh, they're doing a lecture series on the Holocaust, and I've been there 5 times, and I know that at least 3 of the speakers have had some sort of nexus with the Catholic Church. I wasn't. I know I didn't tell you about this, but it just popped up. One of the speakers, Peter Hayes, a retired history professor at Northwestern. There's another professor, Freedy. I forgot her first name. She is a professor at Manhattan College in New York City, the same school where Rudy Giuliani got his undergrad degree. And I spoke with there's a James Waller, who I looked up his background and I couldn't find anything incriminating about him. I can't seem to find this, but maybe you can. His name is Waller, Waller. He's currently a professor at Keene College in New Hampshire. Well, in the early 1990s, he was a lecturer at a Catholic college in Germany. So, as I said, this lecture series is discussing the Holocaust and other genocides that have taken place in the 21st and now 21st century. What the Nazis did, obviously, but other places like Cambodia, Armenia, places like that. So, anyhow, last week, or actually a couple weeks ago, I spoke with James Waller after his presentation. And because, hello, Eric, can you hear me?
Oh, I can hear you. Yeah, loud and clear.
Oh, okay. Sorry. So I spoke with James Waller afterwards. After the speaker's presentation, you can have like little questions from the audience. And then you can, after the presentation is over, you can go over and have a quick little private chat, shake his hand or shake her hand, whoever's speaking. And I actually got a chance to ask Professor Waller a question. And I said, hey, can you tell me who Edmund Walsh was? And it's just like something out of the blue. And he's like, and he said, are you talking about the from Georgetown? I said, yes.
Oh, okay, so he was aware of it.
I'm sorry, what did you say?
I was saying, so he's aware of Edmund Walsh. Yeah, if he said from Georgetown, then yeah, he knows who you're talking
about. Yes, and he said, I'm very familiar with Father Walsh. I read his papers at Georgetown.
I'd like to get my hands on those personally.
Also,
so he's in the papers, like he would see correspondence, for instance, with the Nazi professor Karl Haushofer, the mentor of geopolitics person.
Okay, so one of the things that I knew this, but I didn't tip my hand, and he said, well, yes. So you're talking about Father Walsh, Edmund Walsh, S.J. And you mean from Georgetown? I said, yes, as in the School of Foreign Services. Yes. Well, I mean, I read a ton of his papers when writing books and things like that. I mean, I know among other things he was at the Nuremberg trials. And something I didn't ask him, I dropped the ball. Now, Walsh was supposed to be a priest, supposed to do the mass and hear confessions and things like that. What was he doing at the Nuremberg? Okay, I know what he was, but if you're just an uninformed layman, you have to say, what was he doing at Nuremberg? That was a purely secular matter, or at least it was supposed to be a purely secular matter. He wasn't with the U.S. State Department, or he wasn't with the U.S. Army or anything like that. He had no official. He was not there in an official capacity.
No, very good point, George. And just also, supposedly like Jesuits, they say like they're very adamant about it. They say, we don't get involved in politics on any matter. You don't get involved in secular government concerns. Like I have my book open here, the FBI and the Catholic Church, on page 10, and it says, talking about one of Georgetown's faculty members, Father Edmund Walsh, S.J., spoke regularly at the FBI's National Police Academy. Like, what's Edmund Walsh doing? Like, why is he getting involved politically with the FBI, speaking at their police academy all the like regularly? You know what I mean? Just applying it from like basically like a Catholic canon law perspective is like it doesn't make any sense. It shows that like they break their laws and like their laws are a complete sham, just like a smokescreen to keep like the Catholic masses pacified.
Okay,
you're right, like especially with Nuremberg though, like and like it's an historical fact, like hundreds of Nazi war criminals were like let off the hook at Nuremberg. Like Krupp, like for instance, like one of the key like players to Hitler's intelligence or Hitler's war machine, like Krupp Industries, like he was pardoned as a result of the Nuremberg investigations, and he was like thrown on Time magazine even, in 1957. And Ernest Weissacker, the Nazi ambassador to the Vatican, like only served like 2 years. Not even. Like, he only served like 1 year in prison for him on like a 5-year sentence. Otto Ambros, like one of the top level Nazi IG Farben chemists. Like he was a chemist at Auschwitz. Otto Ambros. He only served like 2 years in jail, and then he became like an advisor to the W.R. Grace Company in the United States, which was chaired by Knight of Malta J. Peter Grace, for instance.
Okay, so he was probably smuggled out through paperclip.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. But Edmund Walsh, like what was like the you could say like the mastermind of Operation Paperclip.
And of course,
like at Nuremberg, like he had two of the attorneys at Nuremberg, William Donovan and James Donovan and William Donovan. Where James Donovan was Jesuit trained at Fordham, and William Donovan might as well have been Jesuit trained. He was a Knight of Malta and a Knight of Saint Sylvester.
Well, yes, he went to
the head attorney. What was his Jackson? What was his first name? I know he was Rob Jackson. He was a Scottish Rite Freemason.
Yes, of course. Well, and he was allegedly Protestant, I believe Presbyterian, but that doesn't. Of course, you need to throw in one or two non-Catholics for cover. For plausible deniability.
Well, like, I mentioned I mentioned the Scottish Rite because I found this interesting. Like I did a post on this, but I found that the 32nd degree of the Scottish Rite Freemasonry has the motto "Ad Morgium Al Gloriam," which is the motto of the Jesuit order. And the 32nd degree with the motto of the Jesuit order is known in the Scottish Rite system, like according to the Masonic sources, as their military degree. So that cannot be a coincidence that their military degree has the motto "Ad Morgium Al Gloriam," and especially that because Jackson was a 32nd degree Mason, which had has the motto of the Jesuit order. And there's lots of U.S. presidents that have been very effective for the Jesuits, like Theodore Roosevelt, Harry Truman, FDR, McKinley, James Polk. They were Scottish Rite Freemasons.
Well, we're talking about people who, technically speaking, weren't Catholic. This is something else I didn't send. I just came across this the other day. I just read a book on U.S. presidents. It was just like a little fluff piece. And I came across something on Herbert Hoover, not J. Edgar Hoover.
Herbert, the Oracle of Wall Street.
Well, yes. Well, Herbert Hoover, even though he was a Quaker, which they're officially known as the Religious Society of Friends, when he got married, they actually had a Catholic priest officiate their ceremony, which is even though technically.
George, just while you're talking, I in the preface I wrote for the Door in the Vatican, I quoted a couple direct connections to Herbert Hoover to the Vatican. I found a letter he wrote to the Supreme Knight of the Knights of Columbus, and he was given a Catholic Boys Brigade medal in 1929, I think, or 1932. To keep going, I'll just pull that up while you're talking.
Well, it's interesting Hoover, President Hoover, Herbert Hoover. By the way, he's like distant cousin. I'm not sure. He was like cousins of J. Edgar Hoover, but that's beside. And he was also distant cousin with the other Quaker president, Richard Nixon. So I don't mean to be crass, but have you ever noticed that all these power players is almost incestuous? That you have to be related to them somehow.
Well, yeah, even recently, I'm pretty sure it came out. Donald Trump was related to Hillary Clinton. They're like 15th cousins or something like that.
And he was also related to Bill Clinton. So, and of course, speaking of relationships, the Hoovers. I'm sorry, I mentioned the Hoovers, but the Roosevelts, Teddy and Franklin, were both cousins, as were Eleanor Roosevelt. I believe Eleanor was Franklin's second cousin.
Yeah, and Franklin and Teddy were descendants of a Catholic priest. If people aren't aware, James Roosevelt Bailey.
Yes. So it's just
but think of it. And I mentioned this in the preface. I talked about how like the Vatican, like I think they gave the election to Herbert Hoover for like a smokescreen to say, hey, like there's no Catholic power in the United States because like our candidate Al Smith lost the election. So see America, like don't worry, like it's still a Protestant country. Like the Vatican isn't controlling your government. Literally, like right after the election, Hoover, this is 1932, so after he served office, obviously it's the Catholics rewarding him, but he was given a medal by the Catholic Boys Brigade, and I quote the exact letter that he sent from like the Hoover presidential website. But like I'll read you the letter he wrote to the Supreme Knight of Columbus. So where's that here? Okay, so this was March 29th, 1932. But he wrote this to Martin H. Carmody. He said, "Dear Mr. Carmody, I cordially congratulate you and through the entire membership of the Knights of Columbus upon the celebration of the golden anniversary of the foundation of an organization which has to its credit so many helpful contributions to education, fraternal benevolence, and the relief of human distress. Yours faithfully, Herbert Hoover." And George, I'll send you the PDF for that. Actually, I'll link this in the show. This is good information. I found like an official PDF of George Bush's speech that he gave at the 2004 Knights of Columbus convention, and it's very revealing to say the least. I think I'll read to you. So I think it's worth reading a little bit of it on the air tonight. But
okay, go ahead.
It shows in that speech by George Bush that like there's absolutely no separation of church and state, and he's talking about like the current Supreme Knight, Carl Anderson, was the Supreme Knight when this speech was given. It was given in Dallas, where the Jesuits killed JFK. G. Gordon Liddy, the Jesuit-trained assassin, was one of the lead Jesuit assassins in that coup d'etat. But Carl Anderson, who is the current Supreme Knight, was the Supreme Knight when this talk was given, and he was trained by the Jesuits. And Carl Anderson, just interestingly, in Reagan's administration, he was one of Reagan's like top advisors. He was like his personal. He was one of his personal advisors in the White House. Mm-hmm. And like I'll read you the quote here. George Bush says like in his speech that like, Carl Anderson is more than just like a man. He's more than just like a influential religious leader who influences presidents religiously. He says he works with them like in their day-to-day operations of the job. I'll pull up the actual quote here. Where is it? Okay, here it is. And George, when I put this into the chat, if you're watching the replay, you'll be able to get the link this way. I'll be able to do that. Yeah, so it's titled George W. Bush's Remarks to the Knights of Columbus Convention. I'll link this in the live chat. Oh. Checking here, having some technical difficulties. Fast reloading. Hey there, George.
Yes, I am.
Okay, I got the PDF open here. Yeah, so this is George Bush gave the speech August 3rd, 2004. This is what he says about Carl Anderson. He says, I appreciate Carl Anderson and his leadership. I've gotten to know Carl because you see, he's more than just an introducer of presidents. So this is what I was referring to. He's more than just an introducer of presidents. He's a person who works with presidents. At least this president, and like he was Ronald Reagan's like personal advisor. And I'm proud to have his help. It's good to see my family friend Virgil Denchant, who is another Supreme Knight, former Supreme Knight. Virgil, it's good to see you, sir. Thank you so much for a warm greeting in the photo op line and reminding me of some great days gone past. I'm proud to be here with Cardinal McCarrick. It's good to see you, sir. He's a neighbor in my temporary residence. I appreciate Cardinal Egan. I appreciate Cardinal Regali of the great city of Philadelphia, Cardinal Francis George of Chicago, Cardinal Keeler of Baltimore, Maryland. I'm honored you all are here. I thank you for your presence. I'm honored to be in the presence of Cardinal Makarski, the Archbishop of Krakow, who succeeded the Holy Father in that role. Welcome to the United States. Appreciate you coming, sir. I appreciate Bishop Wilton Gregory's leadership of the Conference of Catholic Bishops. He's like, listen to this is the President of the United States kissing up to the Catholic. The speech is literally him kissing up the whole speech. I'll just read. I think at the end of the speech, he talks about the immigration wave coming in. He talks about how we need to support all the immigrants coming in, which I thought was interesting. He says, Bush, this is continuing from the president. He says, I appreciate your eminences, your excellencies, reverends, monsignors, fathers, and deacons. I appreciate the officers and directors, state deputies, board of directors, delegates, ladies and gentlemen, knights, and my fellow Americans. Thanks for having me. 2 months ago, I had the privilege of visiting His Holy Father, Pope John Paul II at the Vatican. It was my third meeting with His Holy Father since I took office. Bush ended up meeting the Pope, I think, 6 times during his 8 years. He set the record, actually, for most times a president met with the Pope. Let me see. So I won't read all of it because it'll take a bit too long. The Bush says here, George, the Knights were born in New Haven, Connecticut. Come to think of it, so was I. From the foundations up in a small church basement, you have raised up one of the great America's organizations dedicated to charity and mutual assistance and the fight for civil liberties. And this is how he talks about right after how Jeb Bush became a Knight of Columbus. He talks about the immigrants a bit here. Let me see this. He talks about the need to create Catholic faith-based initiatives with the government. Just an interesting speech if you're recently I found an article done by Newsmax, George, and it was on Donald Trump. And Donald Trump, it was about in 2016, but Trump appointed 34 prominent Catholics as advisors, as official roles in his government. The 34 Catholics, but Bush, he talks about here how he signed an executive order to pass a faith-based charities initiative, giving federal taxpayer dollars to religious charities, which is all money laundering. But he brags about that in this speech as well. I just want to find. I thought he mentioned something about the immigration. If I can't find it in the next 10 seconds. Okay, let me see here. He says you've heard the call. You're helping this nation build a culture of life. He's talking to the Knights of Columbus, in which the sick are comforted, the aged are honored, and the immigrant is welcomed. And there was one other one here. I want to work with the Knights for reasonable and compassionate immigration reform. So what's the Knights of Columbus going to advocate? Actually, James Tamayo, we covered him. He's a Knight of Columbus. He's literally bringing floodgates in Laredo, Texas. The first thing they do when they cross at Laredo is go to James Tamayo's church to get asylum. But I thought it was interesting because the Republicans are supposedly the party that's tough on immigration, right? And Bush is really saying right here in his speech to the Knights of Columbus that we need to allow these immigrants, the Catholic immigrants, to come into our country. And what are your thoughts? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, you know, sorry about that. I had it. Hello, Eric. You're saying, what am I thought? Well, what can I say? It's just like this is, you just mentioned George W. Bush and his speech that he gave back, was it 2004, the Knights of Columbus? This is just an example about how both sides are working together. Is Jesuitical theater and is you have the Hegelian dialectic. Here in the United States, the two major political parties are the Democrats and the Republicans. The Democrats are supposed to be leftist, liberal, progressive, and the Republicans are supposed to be right-wing, conservative, traditional, old-fashioned. They want smaller government, less government, things like that. But in reality, they're working together behind the scenes. This has been the case for I'm not sure how long, but definitely for decades.
Well, you understand with William Howard Taft was a Republican, if I'm not mistaken, and I found documentation that he was touring when he went down to New Orleans. He had a private meeting with the Archbishop down there, and he actually toured the Jesuit college down in New Orleans. And he was Theodore Roosevelt's personal ambassador to the Vatican, for instance. But like that, that shows that the Republican Party has been controlled by the Vatican since the 1800s, like the 1890s, for instance. And you have to think like the Vatican took full control. Like the Republican Party wasn't controlled by the Vatican during the brief time of Abraham Lincoln's presidency. Well, I thought it was really interesting that Abraham Lincoln before Abraham Lincoln, it was a tradition of U.S. presidents, even going what George Washington started this, but it was a tradition, and I found this in the book A History of Georgetown College, that most U.S. presidents would speak at the Jesuit Georgetown University commencement address. It usually every single year while they were president, or they would at least tour Georgetown. It was like a ceremonial thing. But Abraham Lincoln didn't go to Georgetown. So, and after he was assassinated, that tradition began again, which I thought, very symbolic, I think. But when he was taken out, the Republican Party became Jesuitized. And they've always controlled the Democrats. The first, interestingly, the first Democrat to go on the Chief Justice was a devout Roman Catholic, Roger Taney, and he voted to extend slavery. So what does that say about the Democrats? William Grace, the first Roman Catholic mayor of New York, he ran as a Democrat, and he was the chairman of the W.R. Grace Company, for instance. Making millions of dollars trafficking munitions to both sides of wars in South America, for instance. The Democrats, I think, as a party, were controlled from the Vatican by day one. But you can make the case for early on, especially with Lincoln, the Republicans were briefly kind of their own party. But that ended quickly when Lincoln was assassinated.
Well, I'm not going to address this now, but I'd like to talk about this maybe the next show. Is the radical red Republicans of Lincoln's day, but that's a different subject altogether. And something that's correlated to that is who was the Vatican really pulling for during the war between the states? Now, you're of the opinion that they were wanted the South to win because basically, was it Pius IX wrote Jefferson Davis all these letters? They said, "Well, hey Jeff, I'm paraphrasing. Hey Jeff, I'm really rooting for you, and I hope your boys win." But I think Pius IX was just simply pulling his chain. But and I can elaborate that not on this show, but perhaps on our next show. However, something I wanted to mention, speaking of politicians, there's a couple other points I wanted to mention. Talk about a little bit about Portland, Oregon, and one of the Democratic, however they say it, nominee, Pete Buttigieg or Buttigieg or however you say his name. They call him Mayor Pete. He's the mayor of South Bend, Indiana. And he's 37 years old. He was born in 1982. So he would be, if elected, he would be the youngest president in American history. He would be the youngest candidate in American history. Well, speaking of Buddha, okay, the official pronunciation is Buddha Judge, but okay, uh, and I'm not trying to be facetious here. His name is Peter Paul Montgomery.
It's a weird sounding name, and like what recently, like the Secretary of the Treasury, Stephen Mnuchin, the Skull and Bonesman, Stephen Mnuchin. I before I thought it was Munchkin. Before I thought it was Mnuchin. Yeah, this guy is a funny sounding name.
Okay, I'm sorry. Could you just repeat what you just said?
So I just said like this guy with a name I botched a lot was Stephen Mnuchin, the current Secretary of the Treasury, who's a Skull and Bonesman. But I called him Munchkin a few times instead of Mnuchin.
Well, okay, that works for me. But anyhow, Johnny got on my case for calling Donald Trump's current wife melanoma, but it was Melania. But anyhow, Mayor Pete, as they call him, his father, Joseph, well, both of his parents were actually professors at Notre Dame. Well,
that's his into politics, probably.
Okay.
Like Notre Dame, like like the mass murdering dictator Jose Napoleon Duarte of El Salvador. He was running the death squads in El Salvador. He went to Notre Dame, and I have a video on my channel where he went to Notre Dame in 1985, and literally like said like my life values like were built here at Notre Dame, and like the Catholic Church. Like his regime was literally like death squads, like concentration camps, like. But like, Notre Dame is very political. Just the proof of that is look at the list of the Lateran medal recipients that Notre Dame has given, and like you'll see, like it's very political. It's almost like a Georgetown. It's definitely like the most powerful non-Jesuit Catholic university in the United States.
Okay, well, it gets better than that. This is straight off of Wikipedia, but so I'll just read it as is. Early life and education. Buddha Judge, or Buddha Geek, was born in South Bend, Indiana, to Jennifer Ann Nee Montgomery Joseph Buddha Geek. His father, an immigrant from Hermon, Malta, initially studied to be a Jesuit priest before immigrating to the United States and embarking on a secular career as a professor of literature at the University of Notre Dame in South Bend. The name Buddha Geek or Judge is Semitic, Arabic. It actually means poultry in Maltese. Now, his dad.
His dad's probably still a Jesuit priest.
Well, okay.
I was saying if this guy's the youngest candidate to run, like he has serious backing behind him.
Well, okay. So anyhow, so his dad went to his dad Joe went to Hythrop College in London, where he got a PhD, which is actually run by the Jesuits. There's no secret about that. So, young Pete went to St. Mary's High School in Notre Dame. So as I said, his dad studied to be an SJ priest. His parents were professors at Notre Dame. He himself, Pete, went to St. Mary's High School in South Bend. Now, but it gets even better because he is Pete is quote married in quote to his partner Chasen Glisman, I believe, who grew up Roman Catholic, and Chasen got his master's degree from DePaul University in Chicago. Now, aren't officially Catholics anymore. They're Episcopalian. Now, I mentioned this to you before. This is for non-American listeners. The Episcopal Church is basically the American equivalent of the Anglican Church. So they actually got married in this allegedly Protestant congregation. But as I said, what's his name? The judge, the Supreme Court judge, not Kavanaugh, the other one, Gorsuch. Gorsuch grew up Catholic, but he's now an Episcopalian himself. In addition to going to Georgetown Prep, the alma mater of Kavanaugh. So, as I said, traditionally the Bush family has been Episcopalian. Jerry Ford was an Episcopalian.
Although, just with the key interesting with the Bush family, there's like one of the founders of like in terms of one of the earliest financiers in the Bush family, George Herbert Walker, was trained by the Jesuits in England. I think it's very interesting, and like he was very prominent on Wall Street himself. But his name is George Herbert Walker. And just really quickly, George, I just wanted to get this in, but just because there's so much stuff. But just quickly, if you're not aware, I thought it was interesting. Vladimir Putin is like opening up dialogue to the Jesuit Pope, wanting to get closer with Russia and the Vatican. Just recently, in 2017, the Cardinal Pietro Parolin, the Vatican Secretary of State, went to Sochi to see Putin. And there's people can type that up. I just thought that was interesting. Just because I've been looking into with the Venezuela situation with Russia, I've been wanting to see how like the Vatican and Russia have been acting towards each other the last like 3 or 4 years, and it's very very close between them two, to say the least. Like Putin said like 3 or 4 times that like he wants to get closer with the Vatican and open dialogue with Pope Francis. But it's very conservative. It shows Putin's a puppet. Like the Vatican has been like anti-Russia, at least openly, like geopolitically, for like they've been preaching like a crusade against Russia since like 1917, when the Vision of Fatima declared that to the virgins in Portugal that Russia must become Roman Catholic. But I thought that was interesting that Putin's like kissing up to the Pope. Essentially, that's really what's going on, I think.
Okay, and there's one other detail I'd like to mention about Butt Geek. He was in the U.S. Naval Reserves from 2009 to 2017. And he was in Afghanistan for less than a year, which raises the question. Now, Buttigieg, or Butt Geek, or however we say his name, allegedly
was he said to be like on the ground in Afghanistan, like registered, like in the army?
Yeah, he was a naval reserves. He was a U.S.
the most Jesuit-controlled like branch of the Navy's been controlled by the Jesuits, like especially in World War II with all the intrigue that was going on with the Navy.
Oh, okay. So
the Jesuit priest Joseph O'Callaghan, who is the chaplain, like William Hitler, joined the Navy. For instance, Richard Nixon started off in the Navy. Roosevelt, FDR started off in the Navy. Didn't Lyndon Johnson also?
Yes.
Start off?
Okay. So anyhow, Buttigieg or Butt Geek speaks something like 20 different languages, but people will mention that and they'll be impressed. But generally speaking, who else normally speaks that many languages?
The Jesuits, yeah. How old is he again, George?
37, and he looks younger than that.
In general, like Peter J. Doiswick wrote this in Catholic Victory, but like he said in 1960, that's the book, Catholic Victory in 1960. But he said that like a Jesuit or like a lay Jesuit like will, be able to woo people with like all their knowledge, and that therefore like with all just given like how knowledgeable they are, like they have so much access with all the money and resources they have, like in free time, like they have. So think about people have to think about this. Like if you're the Jesuits, literally have all day to do research. Like they don't have to spend like 50 hours a week, like busting their asses just to like pay the bills. Like they're covered financially. And so that gives them like all this free time to read all sorts of books, to do all sorts of research, to study and learn all sorts of different languages. But Doiswick said that Jesuits will be able to, just given like all the knowledge and like the free time they have to study, like they'll be able to woo people with talk when they're talking, and that's how they're able to infiltrate and be effective. And I imagine I'm now that you're bringing up all this great information, George, I'm going to watch some footage of this guy to hear him talk. What he's doing, it sounds like he's a plant for sure. No doubt.
Well, I mean, we can go there even further. We can go. There are other layers. As I said, he was U.S. Naval Reserves. He's a lieutenant or lieutenant for those over in England. He, well, I'm not sure how many people know this, but Afghanistan is a landlocked country. Now, in my opinion, there's no reason for the U.S. any branches of the U.S. military to be over there, but the Navy has even less reason to be there because there are no ports. Um, Also, speaking of Afghanistan,
Well,
um,
Eric Prince, the Knight of Malta, Eric Prince, who of Blackwater fame. Blackwater was like orchestrating like the New Sears Square massacre, for instance. But Eric Prince's Frontier Services Group, like he's lobbying for like to privatize the war in Afghanistan, which I bet the Navy is going along with it. I bet I can't say that for sure, but like I assume certain like the deep state elements in the Navy are trying to privatize the war in Afghanistan, and essentially it would outsource it to Eric Prince's company, Frontier Services Group, which is based in China. Very interestingly, it's like the biggest private military firm in China, which I think is a little concerning.
well, speaking of that,
And if you're aware, Eric Prince calls himself like he calls himself. I think I saw this quoted. He says like I'm a reincarnation of Wild Bill Donovan, with
well,
a big red flag, for everyone that he said that.
well, interesting thing about Afghanistan, in addition to being landlocked, so there's no reason, technically speaking, for the U.S. Navy. Well, as I said, there's no real reason for the U.S. military to be there, but there's even less reason for the Navy to be there because there are no ports. Well, interesting little factoid about Afghanistan: it is 99.7% Muslim, probably Sunni. So that means roughly 3 people out of 1,000 are non-Muslims.
Well, and
However,
you mentioned know more about this story, but you mentioned that the Jesuits have historically backed Sunni governments and movements. Also,
well, yes. Well, however, as I said, it is therefore we've established Afghanistan is almost exclusively Muslim. However, the current president of Afghanistan is Ashraf Ghani, and his wife. Now he's Muslim. However, his wife Rula Ghani is Maronite Catholic. She's Lebanese, so she's Afghani, Lebanese, in the U.S. So virtually nobody, as we forgive me for belaboring the point, virtually nobody in Afghanistan is non-Muslim. However, the first lady is Muslim. I'm sorry, the first lady is Catholic. What is the probability of that?
that's that's probably to maintain the current order of the United States troops guarding the opium fields in Afghanistan. That's probably what that is, I assume.
Okay, so
And an interesting fact, with Afghanistan, before the United States invaded, in like 2003, the Taliban actually briefly passed a law where they said that they banned cultivation from the opium fields.
mm-hmm.
And I think that's definitely like an underlying part of 9/11 that just a lot of people don't talk about, or that was a part of like the subsequent launching the war in Afghanistan. Is to take control of the opium fields and then to put a puppet government in place of the Vatican and the CIA in like Russia to maintain like order. Allow the massive Russian companies like Gazprom and Rosneft and like the American oil companies to, take control of the oil and gas fields out there too. And essentially to maintain order, to create a police state, like to rile up all dissenters. Which basically, goes on in like every Middle Eastern and South American country. And I just recently in the news, George, I thought, Julian Assange, I know some people have opinions on Julian Assange. I think he himself has controlled opposition, but I think he's somewhat genuine. But the IMF gave the Ecuadorian government $4.2 billion like last week after Julian Assange was arrested in Ecuador. So is that like a Jesuit like payment to Ecuador saying like a thank you? Like was that the reward for the hit on Julian Assange? Like
Well, it could have been. So, are you saying that could have been like the John Daly of today? Hey, we'll allow you to cover all these big events of the 1940s. And you know what? as a token of our appreciation, would you like to host this game show? I mean, I'm just using that as an analogy, and thank you for turning
Well,
over.
I think it's a different. I think it's a little different angle with the. I think what the Assange, what they possibly could do, at the Jesuits are thinking, in terms of like crack down on like First Amendment journalism expression. Like they'll say that Julian Assange is a quote unquote non-credited journalist. He's not official. He doesn't have like the establishment credentials, and in future, to become a prominent journalist, you'll have to have like an official, degree from like the Columbia School of Journalism. You'll have to go through their system and have like an accreditation, say that yes, I'm an official journalist. I think that possibly could be part of it. Because essentially, like, there's lots of interesting, like, I've gone through, like, there's a lot of actually information on the Vatican and the Catholic Church in the WikiLeaks dumps. Like, if you go in the search bar, type in Catholic Church, like, there's probably like 40 or 50 pages of stuff, 40, 50 pages of info comes up. Like, I've seen pages that show that, like, Catholic bishops were, like, encouraging the drug smuggling in Mexico. But, like, lots of documents on, like, how the Catholic bishops roles in the coup in Venezuela in like 2002, for instance, with Hugo Chavez. But so like with that, with the information that I've seen from WikiLeaks, I think that Assange, I don't think he was like because John Daly was like completely controlled by the system. I don't think Assange was necessarily like that, just with some of the stuff he's published. And I do think it's interesting that like the IMF gave Brazil that's a lot of money to give them. Like, I don't think it's a coincidence that they gave them $4 billion right after he was arrested. But I do think they're going to try to now like officialize journalism. They're going to say that like if you don't have like an official degree from like the Harvard School of Journalism or Columbia, like you're not an official journalist, and we're not going to take you seriously. You're fake news. So like so a show like what we're doing would automatically be characterized as fake news.
Okay.
For instance.
So just one of the things I wanted to mention, and well, I've covered 4 of the 5 points, and I actually threw in a couple extra ones. The last point is, a few weeks ago, I was watching a video by Paul Joseph Watson. Yes, I've mentioned him before. He's almost certainly a controlled opposition show. He used to be on the Alex Jones / Bill Hicks show, InfoWars. Now, having said that, as I said, he's controlled opposition and he's disinformation. Despite that, even though you may be a disinfo or people may be disinfo agents, they can still say some things that are correct. And I guess Watson did a video last year on Portland, Oregon, and I'll try to clean this up. Is it why? Have you seen any of his videos?
I haven't seen him, no. Paul Joseph Watson, no, I haven't seen him, no.
Okay, he speaks with a very heavy York accent, which is Northern England. It's working class. It's not a typical BBC type accent, but that's besides the point. Anyhow, so he does. He likes doing these videos on the various topics, and as I said, a lot of the things he says are correct. And he said, why Portland, i.e. Portland, Oregon, is a poop hole. And he's talking about the largest city in Oregon, which has a population of something like 700,000, which is about the same size, 600,000 or 700,000. It's almost the same size as San Francisco. So in that town, people can, defecate and urinate in the street. People can do drugs in the street. They have a needle exchange program. People can live downtown in cardboard boxes. People can legally harass. Excuse me. People can legally harass, engage in aggressive panhandling, and the cops aren't allowed to do anything. They're not allowed to enforce panhandling laws or things like that, and it is just really so. Portland, like San Francisco and like Seattle, are turning into third world cities. They're becoming violent. They're becoming dirty, unsanitary, and so as I said, Watson has pointed all these facts out. But but he doesn't go into the why or who's pulling the strings behind the curtain. Well, however, that's where I come in. So I decided to say,
Yeah, there's a guy I watched called Jimmy Dore, and he does that. He gives some, he breaks down some of what's going on, but gives like no answers to like who's pulling the strings behind the scenes. And if anything, he'll blame like AIPAC or Israel.
okay, of course.
Like it's rare that people in the public light will never, touch the Vatican. Like that's a
they might say the Freemasons, or they might say bad Catholics. Bad Catholics who have infiltrated the church, or the seminaries, or things like that.
Often like this, a lot of the propaganda I see is they say it's the Jews and the Freemasons have infiltrated the church, and that propaganda, like that's like the Charles Coughlin propaganda, the Maurice Pinay, the Catholic priest who wrote the Plot Against the Church in 1957, which is like a neo-Nazi Bible. That's the propaganda of the Jesuit priest Father Edward Feeney, like one of like the most notorious anti-Semites in like American history. Father Dennis Fahey in Ireland was like essentially the Charles Coughlin of Ireland, but it was like all this ideology was the same ideology. It was all about how the Jews and the Freemasons were plotting to destroy like the Catholic Church from within, and like they blame like the banking class on like the Jews and the Protestants.
Okay,
and that's why like people like the Rockefellers are actually used in some instances as like propagandists or propaganda by Catholics, like Catholic priests, for instance, or the Rockefellers become like the boogeyman for all of our problems because like they take advantage of, oh look, the Rockefellers are Baptist, oh evil Protestant Masons like taking over everything, for instance.
okay.
But that propaganda is very consistent with Catholic propagandists. They blame, and they also blame the British as well. They blame the British, the Anglicans, but they essentially like the Masons, especially, and the Jews and Protestants.
Well, if I can say this, yes, I mean John Rockefeller, the one from the 19th century, he was a Baptist, and I think some of his children may have been, but they're almost certainly like David Rockefeller, who just died a year or so ago. He was a Freemason, a Papal Knight of Malta, things like that. The same thing with Nelson.
Well, I wrote a recent article. Did you see Did you get the link I sent you on Malcolm Wilson, the lieutenant governor of Nelson Rockefeller, Jesuit trained at Fordham Prep in Fordham?
Yes, I did. Now you're talking about the Anglican Church. The Jesuits pretty much run all of Protestantism: Anglicans, Episcopals, Methodists, Presbyterian, Baptist, Lutheran, you name it. The Pentecostals, the Seventh-day Adventists. There may be a few individual congregations, that home fellowships they don't run, and they pretty much run all of Eastern Orthodoxy. That was I wasn't going to bring up this point, but that was one of the purposes of the Russian Revolution and the Stalinistic purges of the 1930s, the Cold War, things like that, was to, over the course of like roughly 60, 70 years, from the time of the Bolshevik Revolution, 1917, to the end of the Cold War, like roughly 70 years. That was one of the purposes of it, was to basically take over, destroy the Eastern Orthodox churches in Russia, in Greece, and Armenia.
Well, the Saint Sophia Church became literally like a museum, for instance, like humiliating for the Orthodox Church. Yeah,
yes.
the Bolshevik Revolution, it completely stripped of all of their wealth and their assets, in terms of the country as well, which was huge for the Jesuits. And this was simultaneously while they were transferring ownership, I guess. Because Avril Harriman and the CFR, this Avril Harriman, John J. McCloy, even the Rockefellers and the CFR gang was a huge part in financing the Bolsheviks.
Well,
Henry Ford, the Catholic Henry Ford was also big financing the Bolsheviks.
there was a film that came out in the 1950s, and they did a remake of it again in the 1970s. The original one, I believe, was 1956 with Kevin McCarthy, called Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Now, most people took that. I'm not sure if you've seen either version of it, but most people said, that was this film was a reaction to the Red Scare, that the body snatchers were these aliens who landed on Earth and they're taking over human bodies. They still appeared to be the humans, but their insides were basically aliens. Well, you could say, in a manner of speaking, the Jesuits were the body snatchers, if you will. They took over. I'm just using this as an analogy. Uh, you could say the Jesuits took over these churches, the Russian Orthodox, the Anglican, the Baptist, the Methodist, so forth. And on the outside, they may appear to be Russian Orthodox, Anglican, whatever, but inside, they're teaching Catholic/Jesuitical doctrine. They're being run, their clergy, their prelacy, for those who have it, like the Anglicans and Eastern Orthodox, they're Freemasons, and their seminaries are being run by Jesuits or people who've been trained by the Jesuits.
Oh yeah, just recently,
So,
like you had the head. Just recently, the head of the Eastern Orthodox Church met with the Pope with Putin. That was like 2015, and just in terms of a lot of churches, like you had the head of the Mormon Church met with
yeah.
the Pope. You had the head of the Waldense Church meet with the Pope. The Dalai Lama frequently meets with the Pope, for instance. And like the Jesuits that's more research I'm going into now, but we can do that on future shows, is like their infiltration into like different Buddhist sects and like Tao sects. I've found lots of Jesuit scholars who specialize in like the Confucian philosophy, for instance.
Well,
So they
something I may.
infiltrate even in Islam, like they infiltrate all different religions and cultures. And the first book I came across that talked about this was R.W. Thompson's book, The Footprints of the Jesuits. But he talks about, I forget the name of the Jesuit he gives in the book, but he gives like 15 pages talking about this. He talks about there was a Jesuit in India, a prominent one, who disguised himself as a Brahmin, and who then infiltrated like one of the local Indian governments as a Brahmin, and was then like able to send all the intelligence information back to the superiors.
Okay, so sorry, I was talking about Portland, Oregon, but I derailed myself. Okay, so Paul Joseph Watson did a video last year explaining why Portland is such a bad place, but he didn't say who's the man behind the curtain, so to speak. Well, I decided to dig into that, and well, for starters, the chief of police is Danielle Outlaw, which is an ironic name. She went to Holy Names High School in Oakland, California. She also got her undergrad degree from the University of San Francisco. And I guess in the 1990s, she was hired by the Oakland, California Police Department until she transferred to Portland. So you have a woman who's been double dipped, who's the head of the law enforcement agency. That's a red flag. That in and of itself should be sufficient. Sufficient. You know how a short while ago we were talking about Pete Buttigieg, the mayor of South Bend, Indiana, and how Rome basically has her tentacles all over him in terms of his parents, where he went to school, where he served in Afghanistan. Well, there's a similar situation with Portland, Oregon, because all right, the chief of staff for the mayor of Portland is named Kristen Dennis. The mayor, Ted Wheeler. I looked at his background and I couldn't see anything suspicious. As far as I couldn't find anything about his religious beliefs and his education was purely secular. However, as I said, his chief of staff is Kristen Dennis. She got her law degree from the University of San Diego. So so you could say, then I looked up a couple other people. Okay, just bear with me a moment.
Mhm.
So his chief of staff, as I said, got her undergrad degree from University of San Diego.
And then, and that being a private Catholic university, it's a
Uh,
public sounding school, but it's Catholic.
okay, his policy advisor is Amanda Watson. She got her undergrad degree from Georgetown, and his, I guess, his communication specialist is Lucy Segu. She went to St. Mary's College in Moraga, California. So you have at least four people who are involved with the government of San Diego who have Catholic education. Two of whom have went to SJ schools. So who's running Portland?
The Lutherans, yeah, the Jesuits, the Vatican.
Okay, now this is strange. Now, if you're talking about a town like Boston, Massachusetts, New York, Chicago, San Francisco, you would expect this. But the Jesuits don't overtly, openly control Portland. I mean, it is relatively close to Seattle and to Gonzaga, but Portland is just an example of how they've taken over a city, and they probably have controlled it for
I'd say
decades.
they pretty much. I bet all urban centers like over 500,000 where there's significant that's like tens of millions of dollars of commerce happening like weekly in big cities like that. They control all of them.
Oh,
Because as urbanization as like economic globalization, like it's the trend of when people come into the cities, more wealth gets funneled into more hierarchical, um, you know, aristocrats' pockets. More money goes into the banks, more money goes into all the different corporations and churches as well. But that's probably like, and that's why like in most urban centers, like not coincidentally, most urban, especially in America, like in terms of pockets of where do most Catholics live in the United States, most of them live in the like in the big cities. That's where pretty much all the Catholics are located. Like if you look at a population distribution chart, most Catholics live in like cities like really the mega cities, like cities that are over like 7,000 people, and like especially cities like New York that are like 8 million, Los Angeles, 5 million, New Orleans 3 million, Boston like 3 million. These are like super Catholic cities.
so are you talking about a city per se, or are you talking about metropolitan areas?
I'd say metropolitan areas, yeah, in general, but yeah, more.
Oh,
I'd say metropolitan areas, yeah, because that's the trend. Like less and less people are. Um, like this goes for Catholics and non-Catholics. Less and less people are living on the countryside. Everyone's because there's less jobs, so people are forced to come to the cities to find employment.
okay. So we've established, Portland, Oregon. It's the largest city in Oregon. It's
Yeah, and through Portland, if you control Portland, Oregon, you control the commerce of Oregon, and if you control the commerce of Oregon, you effectively control Oregon.
Yes, and it's just like, well, if you control Toronto, you control Ontario. If you control, yeah, just if you control South Tokyo, you control Japan. I mean, yes, there are other major urban centers, but Tokyo is the largest city. It's the capital. It's so Tokyo. For instance, is basically uh, New York. I mean, for Japan, it's basically New York City, Washington D.C., and L.A. all rolled into one.
Yeah, I know. Ever since World War II, yeah, the Vatican's had like their foot on the pedal over there, and they fully control it.
Yeah, well, they control it through Sophia University. There are other schools there, but
Yeah, primarily Sophia. Sophia is like I bet people should go through the alumni list. That's like the Georgetown of Tokyo.
yeah,
Not an understatement to say that.
and of course they control. For instance, they control Lebanon, through St. Joseph University in
Oh yeah,
Beirut.
there's been like 6 or 7 presidents that have been trained there at St. Joseph's,
Yeah.
and like there's new countless government officials, countless. It's a huge list on the. So yeah, if you that's on Wikipedia. People can check that out. Another one that they control the Philippines through Ateneo de Manila University. They control South Korea through Soigang University. Yeah, that's a pattern though. They control France. They have a few, but they control France through the Lycée Legrand in Paris. That's probably like the Georgetown of France, being in Paris, like the key city there.
Okay, I
But
mentioned this.
and just I found an interesting school. There's a Jesuit school that's named like Sanat Kumara, which is like a Buddhist like saint's name. But there's a Jesuit school in Thailand, and like I thought it was interesting because the logo of the school is like a Buddhist lotus, which I thought was interesting. I think that's clear symbolic symbolism that like the Jesuits are taking over Buddhism behind this.
Well, I mentioned Pete Buttigieg, geek. Well, last night, I guess Monday evening, there was, I guess CNN ran a town hall meeting of the leading candidates. There are five of them. I can only name four. The aforementioned Buttigieg, Bernie Sanders, Kamala Harris, and Elizabeth Warren. Just as a quick reminder, we've already talked about Buttigieg. Bernie Sanders' wife is Roman Catholic. Ann O'Mara, I believe is her name. Elizabeth Warren is supposed to be a Protestant. She's a Methodist, but we know that she has spoken at Boston University at least once. Kamala Harris is also.
Boston College.
Oh, I'm sorry, Boston College.
Actually,
I
yeah,
got
that was recently. Yeah, I think that were 2018, and there were Jesuits were there at her talk. That's in the photos on like the news story.
Okay,
She's
and
a
of course,
she's a puppet.
well, of course Kamala Harris, she too is also supposed to be a Protestant, a Baptist. She actually sang in her church choir growing up. However, uh, I forgot the name of her sorority, but it's one you did a video on. So she's boule, as they say. She's also been a
Actually, good info. No, sorry, to keep going on Camille Harris, but I just thought of this. I saw this recently. Tulsi Gabbard was bombasting people for like anti-Catholic. She's saying for anti-Catholic bigotry. That's what it was.
sorry, who is this?
Tulsi Gabbard, Democratic candidate. But she was
Oh,
if you type in Tulsi Gabbard Catholic Church, you'll see her. She was saying that we need to be on guard for like religious bigotry and like especially anti-Catholic. Essentially, just like Trump, the Republican also said we need to be on guard for anti-Catholic bias. But I just wanted to mention that I think showing that she's controlled also. I think she's a left-wing
well,
pawn.
well, it's funny. I know we've talked about this before, and I know you did a video on Donald Trump when he was running for president back in 2016. He was basically saying we need to watch out, or he says something along the lines of we need to guard against anti-Catholic bias or anti-Catholic bigotry or something along those lines. Well, he said that on a commercial for EWTN and at the Al Smith dinner in October 2016, just a few weeks before the election. And there, there seems to be some cognitive dissonance because when he said that, I'm not sure what he was talking about because when he said that at the time, five of the eight Supreme Court justices were Roman Catholic. There was not even one putative Protestant on the Supreme Court at the time. Back then in 2016, and this is still the case, all four governors in the states bordering Mexico, California, Arizona, uh, New Mexico, and Texas, were Roman Catholic.
Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, is Roman Catholic, or Paul Ryan and Pelosi are Catholic, like the Republican and Democratic speakers.
As was John Boehner.
James Mattis, Trump's like right-hand military advisor, Secretary of Defense, Roman Catholic. Lee Cisna, the Immigration Department head, Roman Catholic. The head of the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell, Roman Catholic. The head of the Budget and Management, Mick Mulvaney, Roman Catholic. Secretary of Trade, Robert Lighthizer, Roman Catholic. It's incredible that Trump's saying we need to be on guard for the Catholics when like they literally like fully control the United States government. Like it's just
and of course,
it shows you he's shielding them, and that's why like there's so much talk about like Israel, a 75-year-old country controlling the world, and it's all literally it's a smokescreen because of how like obvious it is that the Vatican is controlling Trump's administration. Once you like your eyes become awoken.
Well, of course,
reality.
You're right about a country. Israel was came into being, or the modern nation of Israel came into being. What 47, 48? So roughly 70 years ago. I'm sorry, I'm getting tired. But anyhow, Israel, whose Messiah was founded by Reinhard Galen.
That's in his like obituary on the internet. Galen found like key player in the Mossad. And Joseph Ratzinger, a Jesuit who founded the Bilderberg Group, was one of the key intellectual players about plotting the creation of the state of Israel.
Okay, so
as well,
I mean, it's after 2:00. It's coming up on 2:15 Eastern time. So we probably should be wrapping up, and we probably could do this again. Maybe later on the week we can send each other an email. I do need to be heading to bed. Just a couple of things. So we're talking about the Hegelian dialectic. If I could just mention something, it seems as if the left and the right in the United States and our media are playing off each other because they're basically Catholic or Catholic controlled. So one of the major issues that have been popular for the last couple of years is the whole Russian collusion thing. And Robert Mueller, the prosecutor who investigated it, issued a report, his findings. And he said, well, I don't think there's any evidence of the Russian colluding with Donald Trump. So the left or the pseudo left says, oh, see, Trump has been vindicated. But the right said, no, he hasn't been vindicated because there's still the possibility of obstruction. And this is basically Obama's birth certificate all over again, which is a variation. Well,
absolutely, and the fact that Putin has been like recently, like the Secretary of State Pietro Parolin went to Sochi to see Putin, and Putin went to the Vatican 2 years ago. He's been calling for more dialogue with the Pope. Like it shows that he's willingly being a pawn. Like he knows that the Jesuit press in the U.S. is propping up all this propaganda about him, Putin, controlling the U.S. government. Doubtlessly, he's going along with it. Like he's like doubtlessly.
But you see, they're hiding. But nobody's ever talked about Vatican collusion. Yes, there was a foreign power, a European power, that did interlope in the U.S. election 2016, as they have been doing since at least.
Well, George, it's impossible to do that just in the U.S. climate. Like you saw Dianne Feinstein. Like she made one little comment about Catholic like influence on like when the Catholic was being sworn in, and she said the dogma lives strongly with you. Like she was a victim of like. I don't want to say Dianne Feinstein was a victim, but like she said one little thing about the Catholic Church, and she was slammed by like 30 press outlets unanimously, like slandered by like probably 20 different congressmen, calling her like an anti-Catholic bigot, just for like saying one little thing. So if you were to talk about how the Vatican was responsible for like World War II or like Adolf Hitler's regime, like I just couldn't imagine how hard like the press would rail you as like an just a bigoted person in general. Like I think it'd be like a blitz. Like it'd be interesting to see. Like
well,
because if they were to do it, doubtless I think there would be some like historians with some spines if that were to happen that would back someone if they were to publicly go out attack the Vatican, let's say, for not doing anything to stop the the violence against the Jews in Europe, for instance, or if they attacked the Vatican for enabling the Rwandan genocide, because this is a fact that Catholic priests were giving mass to Hutu death squads before they would go out and machete thousands of Tutsis. They can butcher them to death, but they were given mass by Catholic priests before that happened. It's all historical fact. Like stuff like that's all historical fact that people could bring up. Like people don't bring up that the Vatican, by its very nature, is a totalitarian church that doesn't believe in the separation of church and state, and you're serving a country that believes. But I do think there would be a few, I think fringe academics that would possibly, support someone who said that. But I think mostly they would be absolutely blitzed by the mainstream media, called like a bigot, it would be like an anti-Catholic, like they'd say it's resurrecting the Know Nothing Party anti-Catholic bigotry of like the 1850s.
Okay, so were you talking about Rwanda in the 1990s, or were you talking about Serbia in the 1940s?
It was basically the exact same thing, but yeah, both Rwanda, but yeah, both genocides were essentially. They played out very similarly. Like Catholic priests were seen carrying with guns on their hips during the Rwandan genocide, just like in Catholic Croatia. Like the Catholic priests, like in terms of Rwanda, like they use like the Catholics have they use the classic dialectical anti-communist crusade. So the Tutsis were equated with communists, and they said the Catholic priests were saying that communism is like the servant of Satan, and therefore like this is a war for like Christ versus Satan. And so that's how like they were brainwashing like their flock. But like Rwanda itself is was a Catholic country. Like I have the president's names archived, but the president that was in power up until 1991. Like he was a devout Catholic. Like John Paul II toured Rwanda in 1988. The Catholic clergy had like a monopoly on like the education in the country. They had them in a lot, like they had just literally like in Ustashi, Croatia. Like they were the biggest landowner, just like in Croatia. They had all that, the political power, economic power.
Okay.
So it's essentially identical. How it played out.
Or you could talk about Armenia in the 19-teens.
Yeah, that being the Ottoman Empire being the perpetrators, but the systemic art of genocide was like essentially the same in all three, like religious extremism.
Well, speaking, people, as far as most people are concerned, what happened in what used to be Yugoslavia in the 1940s was ancient history. You're talking, 70, 75 years ago. Well, actually, not really, because the two main figures of that, and we've discussed this before, the two main figures of what happened in Serbia, the temporal coadjutor, the layman who oversaw it was Ante Pavlovic. You actually talked about it in at least one of your videos. The spiritual coadjutor was Stefanik, Aloysius Stefanik. Later, Aloysius Cardinal Stefanik.
Well, absolutely. Just another one of the key spiritual coadjutors. There's two. I've done videos on this guy, but there's the Jesuit priest Dragutin Camber, S.J., and there was Krunoslav Draganovic, the Jesuit-trained Ustashi, who was the Jasenovic military chaplain. And just really quickly, I mentioned this earlier in the show, just when I talked about how Alan Ryan, who whitewashed the Barbie report, became a professor at Boston College after it. Key of that whitewashing was how Krunoslav Draganovic, the Catholic Ustashi, actually personally like smuggled Klaus Barbie out of Europe, and that's like documented all over the place. I just wanted to mention that quickly. Sorry, keep going, George.
Okay, well, speaking of Stefanik died with 1959, 1960, so about 6 years ago. However, and he was convicted. He was sentenced to 16 years in prison. He only served 5 years, so not even a third of the sentence. So it's very similar to Nuremberg. And even though he actually got elevated to the cardinalate. but as I said, you're not talking 60, 70 years ago. He's actually there's that. I kid you not. There is actually a movement, I guess, in Croatia to get Stefanik elevated to saint. And so back in
Well, actually, George,
2016,
I saw this on a source. The president of Croatia during let me see, pull up this guy's name here. He was the president during like 2000. He made a statement at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and he blamed the Ustashi massacres on the Jews. He said the Catholic Church had nothing to do with the Ustashi massacres. Yeah, his name was Franjo Tudman. That was this guy's name here. We pull up his full wiki here. Yeah, this guy was blaming literally like how like this gutless is that blaming. I guess it's predictable. Like this guy's sold his soul to the Vatican. His name was Franjo Tudman. He was the first president of Croatia from 1990 to 1999. He's Jesuit trained, mostly Catholic. Yeah, he says Tudman's mother was a devout Catholic, so he's indoctrinated into the Vatican system of thinking. But I just want to mention that he was denouncing the Ustashi genocide as a Jewish plot, which just I guess shows you how low the Catholics will go. Sorry, keep going.
Okay, well, just wrapping this up, Stefanik actually got his sentence, post-mortem, vacated. They got it thrown out afterwards, even though he'd been dead since 1960 or thereabouts. So even though he did get convicted, he's sentenced to prison for 16 years and served 5 years. Post-mortem, they actually got the people who were trying to get him canonized, declared a saint, got his sentence afterwards readjudicated to where they said he wasn't convicted. So he's on the path to being a saint. So when Stefanik's apologists are spinning him as, oh no, he was not a war criminal, he was a hero. He fought against the communists.
Yeah, Admiral Manhattan said that the way that the Vatican did it, he said it would have ashamed the most deceitful of devils in the lowest pit of hell. Like how the cover up, they turned Stepniak into like a saint. I mean,
yes.
the Knights of Columbus built the Archbishop Stepniak School in New York, and that's still up to this day. And that's like a disgrace. But
okay,
that's up in the United States. The Archbishop Stepniak High School.
Okay, and I can see how they're doing that. So, no, he wasn't. So his apologists are saying, no, he wasn't a war criminal. He was a hero. Yes, he was brutally killed at least thousands, if not tens of thousands of people.
Yeah, actually, the source, just quickly, George, the source for this is Genocide in Satellite Croatia by Edmund Paris. But like Stepniak was literally saying stuff like, thank God for Adolf Hitler and stuff like that.
Yes.
Like this is the type of guy he was, just the vilest war criminal.
Okay, but they pull the same stunt with Franco, with Pinochet. Fill in the blank. Almost any thug in Europe or Latin America who was responsible for the death of at least thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people. They said, well, yes, they may have killed those people, but they deserved it. They were convicts.
Yeah, they did it recently with Rios Montt in Guatemala. He was responsible for the killing of like 100,000, and his brother was a Catholic priest the whole time this genocidal regime was in power, and he had the support of Reagan, like Pat Robertson, Jerry Falwell, like the co-opted like Protestant evangelical right in the U.S. Because he supposedly converted from Catholicism to Protestantism before he massacred all these people. So like his brother was a Catholic priest the whole time during his regime, which I think which makes me think that was a Jesuitical Inquisition. It was a plausible deniability to blame Protestants for Rios Montt's like dictatorship.
Okay, so yes, I was probably I'll have to finish this point. This is a teaser that reminds me of Mark David Chapman, but I'm going to have to leave you on that note. The alleged assassin of John Lennon. I'm sorry, I'm getting carried, so I'm fading mentally. I wasn't saying I wasn't there to begin with, but anyhow, that reminds me of something, and I'll probably have to pick this up the next time we do a show. I mentioned Mark David Chapman, who allegedly killed John Lennon back in 1980, and I say allegedly um, because that reminds me of something. If you think of almost all the famous assassins, murderers, mass murderers, things like that, going back to at least the 1960s, mostly in America, but in other places. You had to wonder how many of them were actually killers and how many of them were just patsies. Or if they did actually do the killing, how many of them were mind controlled or mind manipulated?
James Holmes was mind controlled during the Aurora shooting. That was seen in his like hearing where he was like zoning out, looked like he was high on heroin or something. He was like fading in and out of
Oh,
consciousness.
okay. So, but we'll have to pick that up on the next show because, as I said, I've been listening to Mae Brussels, and I'll just say this: thank
Well,
you for turning me
I'm
on to
pretty
this.
sure I haven't heard this show. But have you heard it? She goes into Sirhan. I'm pretty sure. I think she goes into how he was like a drugged up, Manchurian style candidate, when RFK was assassinated.
Okay, yeah. Well, in her opinion, and I happen to agree with her, he actually wasn't the trigger man. He was basically another Lee Harvey Oswald.
Okay, actually, okay, and then so he part of his programming was to program him into not saying anything, so to drug him up and to pacify him. And actually, like I've heard her say, the owner of the hotel, or what was his name? The owner of the hotel where he was.
Shine,
What was his name?
David Shine.
David Shine. Yeah, he was a Knight of Malta, the owner of the
Yeah.
hotel.
Funny thing. Okay, she wasn't. Okay, I'm not sure. I mean, towards the end, I think she was becoming a little bit more awakened. She may have been red pilled because I listened to a program from like the early 1970s until like the late 1980s, just prior to her death. The more initially in the early 1970s when she was doing her shows, it was more it was conspiratorial, but it was semi-mainstream. But the longer she did the show, the more she started talking about the Vatican, the Knights of Malta, the Knights of Columbus, and so forth. Um, and I think that could have, in my opinion, I have no proof of this, but there's a good chance that could have led to her early demise. But we could probably pick that up the next time.
Oh, I agree. Yeah, and she definitely you can hear the progression with her. Like I actually heard it on a broadcast. She acknowledged that. She said that when she said like I put it all together. Like when especially she talked about how when I made the connection with the Knights of Malta. So all the high level players in like the U.S. Army intelligence and like the Nazis being Knights of Malta, like Franz von Papen, for instance. Like she said it all, tied together. And,
But
and
one of the
that is what happened. I do think though, just with her, like I think she may have been I think the Jesuits may have deceived her a little, because I think I don't know, I couldn't, I'm not allowed to ask her, but I think she was under the impression that the Knights of Malta were a group that was higher in the pecking order than the Jesuit order. Because I think she failed to realize that the Jesuits are a military order, more so of a military order than the Knights of Malta. I think she thought the Jesuits were more of like a priestly order, because, there are left wing Jesuits like Father Drinan, for instance, who are supposedly like anti-war, supposedly, and the Jesuits, tend to be more on the left wing side of politics. Like they were behind like the Sandinista revolutions and like the liberation theology movement down in South America. So I think that gave her the impression that they were more of like a priestly organization rather than a military organization. But
well,
in terms of like she did talk about Edmund Walsh, a decent amount. Um, but I just heard her like talk about how Father Drinan. I think, and there were Jesuit, like the Jesuit in El Salvador, Archbishop Romero was assassinated in 1981. And that would give the impression that the Jesuits aren't the top of the pecking order if they one of their guys was killed, for instance.
well, there's any number of ways of taking that. But as I said, we'll have to. I want to talk about this, but we'll have to pick it up on the next show.
All right, sounds good. Yeah, it is getting late. And actually, just
Okay, so
quickly, I recently listened to a good Mae Brussel show. It was titled "Joseph Mengele is a U.S. Citizen." I think that's what it was. But it goes into all of Mengele's activities, post World, like, post paperclip. And people aren't aware, Mengele, the Angel of Death, was a Roman Catholic. That's
oh
probably
yeah,
maybe
yes.
that's a good way to end off the show.
Okay, well, yes, and we'll have to pick it up. So it will have a good evening / good morning, Eric, and I guess I'll talk to you soon.
Yeah, I'll talk to you soon, George. Take care. And thanks everyone for tuning in. All the best.
Okay.
Bye.
Okay.